We zijn nog niet live, hè? Nu wel. All right. Good morning, everyone. Gonna wait a few more minutes, seconds to let everyone join this webinar. And in the meantime, when you arrive, indeed, just I see the chat is already active. Just drop a short message in the chat. Maybe let us know where you're dialing in from. Always nice to see where our audience is coming from. And like I said, we're gonna give it a few more minutes that everyone is arriving. And as soon as we are there, we're gonna kick this one off. There is someone, I see someone is joining from Zambia, Oslo. That's nice. Okay, some more people dropping in. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending from where in the world you're dialing in. And I think we are 1 minute in, and that means we are gonna start this webinar off. So welcome everyone. Really happy that we have such a nice number of participants joining that webinar today. What will we cover today? I think a topic that is resonating a lot in the market, that we heard a lot. We also just came back from the EIC, the European Identity and Cloud Conference in Berlin. We're gonna have it together with myself. I'm Christian. I'm looking after the commercial activities, and I have Martin, our VP product and co-founder of Alimity, and we're gonna take a look at identity data fabric from identity chaos to visibility. Before we're gonna dive into the topic and I give you a short idea from what we're all covering, maybe just some housekeeping. I see already the chat is active, so please use the chat to ask your questions. There's also the possibility to ask questions. We will cover them at the end of the webinar. For the rest, I think we're gonna aim for something like half an hour to 40 minutes, also depending how long the Q&A will be. And I'm gonna work you as the host of today pretty shortly through our agenda. So we first will give or especially Martin, who will be responsible for the content today. We will give you a good introduction about the identity data fabric, value and use cases, how to build your own identity data fabric. And of course, like I already said, we're gonna have the possibility for a conclusion and of course, all your questions that we will answer during that webinar. And I think with no further ado, Martin, I will hand it over to you, and looking forward for that really interesting topic of today.
All right, perfect. By the way, Kirsten, I see that Eric mentioned that there is a lot of lag. Maybe you can take it up in the chat in the meantime. So I'll get it started. So this is the agenda of today, like Christian summarized. So we're talking about the identity data fabric. It's a newer term in the identity and access management space. So maybe let's start off with introducing the concept. So briefly said, identity data fabric is a concept, a newer concept within cybersecurity and identity management, and it refers to, well, a unified layer of identity-related data. So ideally, it goes across your systems, applications, and environments, even when that data about users, permissions, and so on is distributed across multiple sources like an Active Directory, Enter ID, cloud applications, databases, maybe an IGA, a PAM, CM, all of that together. And if you bring together that data of your users, your accounts, your permissions, your roles, whatever that you have, then and all of that and link it together, you get what is called an identity data graph. We call that a graph because it's essentially a large data set that links an employee to the several accounts that he has, to the permissions, then maybe from Active Directory to Enter ID to file share to SharePoint and so on. And essentially it represents who can do what within your organization at any point in time. And so ideally, this data graph provides a unified view, like we call it. It keeps this data up to date. So you shouldn't be working anymore with manual exports and so on. So it should really provide real-time historical analysis. Ideally, it also separates the identity data from your underlying identity and access management tools so that you have a separate system where you can work and do your analysis on without any impact or performance impact, for example, on your operational tools. And ideally, it also enriches the data with some business context, like, for example, in the most basic case, the information from the HR system. So you also know the department, the location, the risk level, and so on to enable better decision making. So this decision making, that's really the essence of why you want an identity data fabric or identity data insights. Because in practice, well, traditional IAM systems often operate in silos. Even if you have a large IJ already in place, and you still have an IJ for that, a PAM for that, like CyberArk, CM like ForgeRock for your customer identities and so on. Many companies don't have the centralization in an IJ in the first place, so then it's really still Active Directory, SaaS applications, file shares, cloud infrastructure. Those are all your operational structures, operational sources. And this fragmentation then makes it hard to answer basic questions like who can actually currently access what? And is this access appropriate? And where are the highest identity risks, for example, from a security perspective? And these are just three examples of data questions related to IAM, but in a company of a decent size, then there are many employees with many different data questions. Like you see here on the slide, there are security experts that are interested in things like orphaned accounts, or accounts of people that already left the company, or insider threats, or guest accounts, and all of these things. Compliance people maybe want to know about the reviewing of all of these accesses, or who can access privacy sensitive folders in a GDPR context, or separation of duty for submitting and approving invoices, for example, which could allow fraud. And IAM experts are interested in more analysis, like maybe designing new roles or looking at the descriptions or the meaning of Active Directory groups or cleaning up all of that, or even thinking about synchronization errors between Active Directory and Azure. The data questions that we see in practice are really incredibly versatile. And then we're not even talking about people like application owners or line managers or role owners or all of these people. And so an identity data fabric really has the goal to enable all of these people to to find answers to these questions by acting as a data backbone, if you want, for identity related decisions, risk analysis, compliance, and so on. Much like, so very much in line with a data lake, the typical approaches that we see these days in more data oriented parts of a company, but then specifically for identity, optimized for identity specific use cases. And so in total, you can you can build a lot of different use cases on that data fabric, on that identity data graph. Here we illustrated a couple of them at the top of the slide. And for this presentation, we've chosen to focus on 4 example use cases, just to give you some more insights in what you can do with an identity fabric. Here also completely focused on cybersecurity and on compliance. So we went for fast risk remediation, then so the risk analysis and the cleanup, then identity governance, because it's also a lightweight form of governance. Then something more for the enterprises, empowering IAM professionals, really giving them the tools to do the analysis and get the insights that they need. And then something more in the space of, well, AI, machine learning is also using this data for automated role mining, which is also a focus within the IAM community, or has been a focus in the IAM community for like a decade now, I think. So let's go to each of these 4 in the next slides to give a bit more insights in what you can do. So the first thing is risk analysis and cleanup, or like I like to call it as well, the fast risk remediation. And there the goal really is to detect and clean up user access risks with as little effort as possible. So this really is the approach of the previous slide. So your operational sources, you bring that together for your most critical systems, and then you apply IAM security controls. Even if it's just a one-time exercise, you then get a quantified list of where your risks are. And I'll get back to that later in the presentation as well, but we provide a framework of security controls ourselves, the 8 categories that you see on the right here of this slide. And from our experience, the most critical ones for most companies definitely are the orphaned accounts. So accounts that really shouldn't be there anymore. They're just leftover risks. So definitely clean them up. They're just waiting to be misused. And secondly, privileged accounts. So you really have to know these days who has admin permissions across your different systems and then put extra controls or two-factor authentication for the least on all of those. And then there's things like data quality, role hygiene, separation of duty around financial systems. Whatever is important to your organization, you want the data to know whether there are risks, how many active admin AD accounts, for example, there still are that were linked to an employee that already left your company, all of that. So in practice, if you do this as a one-time exercise, this is sometimes called an identity scan, identity assessment, or an identity pen test. And you can do this once and then work from there in theory. Although we see that in practice, you probably want to work on up-to-date data. And if you're then cleaning up the findings, you want to track progress over time. So what you do see is that you naturally evolve to repeating this exercise. And then the step towards more continuously monitoring these security controls comes naturally. And that's actually the second use case. So if you do this exercise, but in a more continuous fashion, in a more closed loop approach, then you actually get a lightweight form of identity governance. So if you automate the data collection to then achieve continuous monitoring, you create visibility, you can review, you can act on that, and you do that in a continuous cycle. That's actually a form of, well, provable control, because you have visibility, you apply security controls, you track what you do on that, you can even prove that you are improving over time. And in the essence, in the first step, in the review step there, you first do that for the core security team. They can look into the controls that you've seen on the previous slide. But of course, at some point, they don't know everything anymore. You have to involve other people as well in this exercise. And then it becomes a natural next step to also grow towards something like access reviews to include team leaders and application owners or site owners or data owners, whatever that you have or that fits in the governance of your organization, to also include these in the review step, as you see here. And this is really a way to use your data to become continuously in control. This does not do everything that a full IGA suite would do, because we're now in the governance space here. It doesn't do the automation and the provisioning, but in total, it does provide a closed loop approach to show auditors or maybe a CISO that you're effectively in control, making this a lightweight form of identity governance, and something that you see that's very relevant to highly regulated companies, for example, with smaller security teams that probably don't have the ability to roll out a sale point and do that complete exercise, or even larger enterprises where you might still have blind spots or things that aren't covered by other tools that you still want to have visibility on, that are not continuously or automatically provisioned. You still want to have visibility and control over that. So this really is a lightweight approach to still have that provable control within that space. Then the next example that we thought was relevant here also is something that you probably see more in larger enterprises, where it's about empowering IAM professionals. So what you see there is that in a typical, let's say, a large financial institution, you see that governance processes like exit requests and reviews are typically done, but it's all with very little understanding. And so from a risk perspective, you can question what is the effect here actually on, for example, cybersecurity risk, even though everything is actually reviewed. And that's again where data comes in. So in that sense, what the application of the data fabric here is essentially, remember the slide with all of those data questions that you provide this data of your accounts, your permissions, your business roles, your technical roles, your applications, all of that is an easy to use fashion to all of the people that you saw there. So IAM analysts, security analysts, system owners, system team leaders, SOC employees, even that's what we see in practice. All of the people that have questions at any point during their job about who can access what is this account, what is this role. At any case, stop providing this information to manual Excel sheets and then importing it and sending it over via email, but rather apply the same mindset as what you see with a Power BI, for example. So you automate the data collection behind the scenes, that you provide always up-to-date data in an easy-to-use fashion to all of these people. And really, in an enterprise, you see that there are many of these people. In this use case here, it's about more than 500 people that continuously or daily use the system to get fast answers to all of the data questions that they have. And this really is a speed up for their job at one hand, But then on the other hand, also it improves decision making, so it has a positive effect on risk, on IM, operational efficiency, and so on and so on. And then the fourth thing is that if you have all of that data, it also becomes logically or becomes it also makes sense to put some machine learning or AI on that. And there are many things where you could use this data for, but probably one of the more holy grails that we have in the at least in the governance space within identity and access management is role mining. So typical manual approach, probably something that I don't have to tell you, is to do that top down where you do business interviews with everyone in your organization. You model your business flows, and you actually model who should be able to do what, which is a slow and tedious process. And the reasoning behind role mining is that probably the answer to what should people have is also hidden within the data of the permission that they currently have. So that's something that neatly aligns with that. You could do this exercise bottom up. So you look at your current permissions. So you make a graph, like we said before, for your employees with their accounts, and then maybe their AD groups, their enter ID permissions, or the databases that they can access, or the stuff in SharePoint and so on. And then you look at commonalities. So you try to group on any attribute that you have in HR, like job title, place in the organization, the manager, the function description, all of that. And really, based on that, you can really neatly, mathematically actually put a threshold on there and say, well, everything that is assigned to more than 80% of the people in a group, we just put in a role for that complete group. And then you can take a look at how many of the current permissions you would lose, though that's under granting, and how many you would add, that's over granting. And then you could look at optimums there in that process. And that's not the holy grail, or it's not a silver bullet, I think, because it's not complete, it's not perfect, but at least in a few days of work, it does give you what we like to call a birthright role model. So things that you can give or can grant to someone new just based on his or her attributes, and then the rest can be asked or requested and then approved and so on. And so this really speeds up the whole role design, especially for organizations that are taking their first step in there. But of course, you still have to think with that. But I definitely would recommend to use data there as well to ease that burden of creating those roles and so on. So those were four, at least we think, interesting examples of how you can use an identity data fabric. There are many more in practice, but the essence here is that data really is a core part of well, any activity that we do in IT these days. So definitely also identity and access management. So from that matter, I would definitely highly recommend to use data in your identity and access management strategy. It's something that we see happening in many organizations. So it will simplify and support many of the processes in there. That's why we decided to spend this time on talking about the identity data fabric. But okay, that's all nice and dandy if you want, but how do you actually get started then in practice? So as a second part of this presentation, let's take a look at a practical approach to build your identity data fabric. And so, like we said, there are lots of companies that are already trying to do that or taking their first steps in this. And what you see in practice are things like sysadmins that are running PowerShell scripts and so on that then produce Excel sheets that are then shared via email. And this way of working typically leads to people doing the same work over and over again. And it's really not where you want to be as an organization. That's the first step in the maturity. Another approach is that you leverage your existing, well, more centralized tools. If you have a large scale PAM deployment or a large scale IGA deployment that connects or collects the information of many different applications, then that's definitely a very valuable point to start. But in practice, you see that it's often only a part of your data, and also the reporting functionality of these applications are not where you want them to be. And so what you see that some of the highly mature IAM teams are doing these days that we've seen in practice on the complete other end of the spectrum is that they are setting up their own entire data lakes specifically for identity and access management analytics. And so in that case, data engineers bring together the data from the various systems in a structured way. You then build specific dashboards in Tableau, Qlik, Power BI that others then consume. And this definitely is a more structural approach, more robust approach to implementing a data fabric. But it also requires a lot of work, and it's not something that just any organization can do and can maintain over time. So in that sense, none of these strategies really is sustainable. What we'd rather want is really a Power BI specifically for this, I would say. So a system that is designed for identity data fabric, something that turns this picture, into this picture. And essentially, what you want here is that it should be easy to collect IAM data from various IAM systems. So you don't waste time on that. You don't reinvent the wheel every time and time again. It should be easy to then understand IAM data, for example, by clicking through on accounts, on roles, on linked entitlements, and so on. Keep this data up to date, so your people are always working on the more recent data, the most recent data. And then, if it's possible, actively monitor key controls over time, put on notifications there, or even run your governance process on top of the same data foundation. And that's our vision on a good platform, an integrated identity data platform, we like to call it. And based on this vision, that's exactly why we built Elimity, why we started Elimity. We provide a platform called Elimity Insights, and it really is a data platform specifically designed for IAM. So it's an extensive framework for connecting to any source that you have, easy insights, automated monitoring, the notifications. We were founded 5 years ago, well, 6 years ago by now, and our platform is used typically by, I would say, CISOs or IAM leaders of companies from several hundreds to hundreds of thousands of employees. And in the next slides, I wanted to go a bit deeper into how you actually set this up. And what we chose for this webinar is a customer case of a company of around 12,000 employees. And they wanted to increase their internal control. That really was the driver behind looking at identity data fabric in order to decrease cyber risk, show compliance, but they still had to do a lot with a small security team, or at least small compared to the complexity that they were facing. And so our standard approach in this context works in 5 phases. First phase is that you look at your most important applications and you want to create first visibility as quickly as possible. And in this case, we are talking about Active Directory, Entra ID, Azure AD, like it's mentioned on the slide, SailPoint, CyberArk, and SharePoint. That's one of well, those are 5 of the, let's say, 10 most common systems that we see in practice. And the goal there is really to use just out-of-the-box connectors, so you have that data in there in just a few days. Or if you really want for custom source, you go for manual export and import, just to have that first visibility as quickly as possible. And like we show here on the slide, compared to the other IAM project that we see out there, this is a matter of days, ideally. Not weeks, definitely not months. The first visibility, you want to get there as quickly as possible. And so this way, you build your identity data foundation, your overview of who can access what across your systems. Ideally, you also pull in the HR system, like I said before, to tie everything together so you can link the accounts of the different systems that you have to the person. You also have the metadata from the HR system to do analytics on. So like the end date is really important and powerful. The manager name, the job title, everything that you want to group people, to look at orphaned accounts, to have an understanding of who they are and what they should be able to do. And then you get an overview of your employees, their accesses across the different systems, and you can really dig into this data. So you can get insights from that data, for example, by looking up specific users, clicking through to their accesses, looking up who can access specific sites, folders, applications, or even if you really want, looking for outliers in the access of people by grouping them on the same team to cut out excessive permissions and so on, or maybe use this data for the role binding exercise that we talked about before, if you want to do this in a more manual way. And in this case, in the case of this customer, security was an important driver, which, by the way, I would say is the case in 75% of the projects that we do, or the deployments that we do. The other 25% can be more around identity and access management KPIs, maybe reorganizations and so on. In this case, it was security. And then we also help them apply that set of security controls that I talked about before. And so, like I said, we typically work in 8 categories of security controls. Our team has written an awesome guide about that. I can give a presentation of 2 hours on this topic alone, but I won't do that today. So if you're interested, take a look at the guide that is here listed on this slide, and we'll share that afterwards as well. But in practice, the most important ones from our experience, like we said, is the orphaned accounts, privileged accounts, separation of duty in a financial context, and then always as well business specific controls, so things that you know that are important for your organization, like maybe separation between geographies or between departments, or separation between the production environment versus test environment and so on. And in the platform, you then apply these controls as what we call queries, stored queries on the data. And then you easily get an overview of your largest risks. Those things are automatically monitored over time, so you get notified if something changes, if these risks go up. It's easy to get necessary compliance reports from those controls. And really, this shows you that you're continuously in control. And the most important thing of that monitoring is not that all of these controls are zero or green from the start. No, the most important thing from a compliance perspective is to show that you're on top of things, that you're really improving over time. But also, if you're really in control of some of these things, let's say an easy example, the members of a critical group in Active Directory that gives permissions to admin databases, for example. If you want to monitor that and you see that something has changed that shouldn't be there, that you're actively on top of things, you get notified, and the day after you remove the incorrect access. That's really what it means to be in control. And in this case, the case of the project or the customer that we were talking here, the CISO, as the very first step, wanted to focus on Active Directory first. And after a few hours, you have that data. They were able to find orphaned accounts with that. So you have a HR system and Active Directory, you find accounts that shouldn't be there. And then it's really a matter of cleaning that up. And the most critical ones were cleaned up, disabled in a matter of days. And that was really what was really important to the CISO, because identity governance has an image of being very expensive, months, years of work, multi-million projects, and so on. And here the CISO wanted to show that you can apply a risk-first approach. Rapid success can be made, really to buy goodwill with everyone in the business, to show them that this is also a problem that they could fix over time. So the overall impact there, clear view of the largest risks, Active Directory first, and immediate security improvements, audit proof of doing this work, so it automatically follows up if you have made the necessary changes. And then that's perfect input to prioritize their next steps. And in this case, they included more sources, so you grow in the span or the scope of your identity data fabric. Like we said before, in this case, it's Enter ID that was added, then their IGA, then HAM solution, SharePoint, and afterwards, I think even database admins, local accounts from SCCM in this case, and file shares. That's also a common one that you see in practice. So that's one part or one axis in which you can grow the number of sources. And then the other one, the phases 4 and 5 on this slide, is really where you include more and more people. So the core concept, the screenshots that you've seen before on these slides, that's an interface is typically used by the core security team, so people that are used to think about the complexity of all of these identity sources. But at some point, well, they don't know everything anymore. If you see a potentially orphaned account, then you're not sure whether this really should go, whether this can be disabled, and you probably want to include other people like team leaders that are responsible for the accounts in their team members, or application owners for their applications. You want to include them as well. If you don't do that, just you want to think that through. You don't do that by just giving them all of this data, rather to the form of access reviews. But that's how you grow to including other people as well. And step by step, you mature your governance processes to something that really shows that you're in control. But at a much lower total cost of ownership. So in that sense, this is an example that focuses on cybersecurity, but I hope that at least it shows that you should make identity data key to your IAM strategy. This here focuses on governance, but as we saw in the examples before, if you then want to grow to maybe applying machine learning to using that data also to enable to help all of the people that have IAM questions, then by all means, it's all the same data fabric, and that's really the power of making data core to your IAM strategy. So in that sense, what is the summary that we've seen here? So identity data fabric is really about bringing together the data of your disparate identity silos into one identity data graph, with the goal of providing understanding. And the most basic understanding that comes out of this is who can currently access what. And on top of that, you can build many different use cases. The most common one that we see in practice is from a cybersecurity perspective or from a compliance perspective, where you want to show that you're in control, where you want to look at the most important risks, but others are possible as well. And how to get started? Well, we definitely advise you to avoid manual data work, even if it's not with our specific platform. At least avoid manual exports and imports because that will grow. You will grow tired of that very easily, and it's really important to be able to work on the most recent data, on up-to-date data. So go for some dedicated platform and approach that fits your organization. But in any case, highly recommend to make data a core part of your IAM strategy, much in line with how it's a core part of any IT strategy these days. And Christian, that's everything that I at least wanted to talk about. On this slide, to the audience, you can see a couple of links to some of the resources that we talked about. If you want to know more, you can also book a demo about the product itself, the platform itself. But if you want to go deeper into the security controls yourself, then the bottom right link here is the guide that I talked about before with all of our identity controls. And if
All
there are any
right.
questions, then we still have time for that as well.
Indeed, I was just about to say. So, Martin, first of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. I think there was a lot of value presented over here. So indeed, now it's up to our audience. If you saw something or you've been intrigued by something or you disagree with something or you saw something that's interesting, you want to dig a bit deeper, like we said, there are a couple of more minutes time for that. So if you have a questions, please feel free either to drop it in the chat or in the question section, and then we will take that up. Let the people give a little more time for that, and then we will take the first one. There's already questions are coming in. Martin, first question I see here from someone who said, I have 3 different IGA systems across a complex platform. Would that also be working with the approach that was presented?
Yeah, of course. That's maybe one of the examples of the maybe less security focused, more IAM focused use cases. So I would be guessing, I don't know who asked the question, but I would be guessing that it's a larger enterprise, and especially in a context where you have M&A, so you acquired other companies, and it's a very complex environment, maybe with disparate Active Directories, IGAs, all of that. There's synchronization from one end to the other, disparate HR systems, and so on. That's really a perfect context to apply this data governance, because probably you're in a project, I'm guessing, to unify all of that. It's not always easy. Well, it's never easy. It's not always possible even. And in that sense, at least have data visibility across these IGA systems, again, to answer the question, who can currently access what? And in some of the cases that we've seen in that context, it's even about, well, there's this downstream flow of identity data, there are synchronization errors, duplicate email addresses, enter ID eventually says, no, I cannot provision this user. Where does that come from? All of those data questions that you might want to answer from that perspective as well. That's the role of an identity data fabric in a company like that.
All right. So in short, yes, also with 3 IGAs, that concept
Especially with 3 IGAs, maybe.
would be really interesting. I think that question intrigued someone else with a totally different environment, asking, okay, this from that answer, it feels like it's something only for organizations that have a high maturity in the identity journey. Is that also something that would benefit customers that are in their, or like organizations that are in their beginning of the journey, meaning they don't have maybe not even an IGA or not even a pump system yet, but still struggle with the question, who has access to what?
Yeah, definitely. So in this presentation, we zoomed in on the general concept of identity data fabric, and it's something that you can use for larger enterprises as well as smaller enterprises, but smaller companies. But essentially, the use cases that we talked about here, so the identity governance, that's something that we see mostly being used in practice by smaller companies. So the companies that do have security requirements, maybe compliance requirements. I'm thinking about small insurers, smaller banks, not the tier 1 banks probably, but still they have to adhere to the same regulation, like DORA, NIS2, and so on, but with a smaller security team. In that sense, automating your complete joiner mover lever flows typically out of the question. Too much work. They don't have the budget or the operational or the manpower to do that. And in that case, this approach really is something that you can use to show that you're in control at a much lower total cost of ownership. And in that case, yeah, definitely. That what you then see is that you start with almost exactly the approach that we talked about in the rest of the slides. So first visibility, focus on security controls, and then start growing towards role models, maybe provisioning for core applications. But you focus on data first, on this control and these compliance checks first, and then do the expensive steps like the provisioning, the role design, separation of duty, policy design, all of that, do later on in the process.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think those were mainly the questions. Maybe
Okay.
give
Good
another 30
questions.
seconds. Otherwise, if you still have a question afterwards and you don't want to have it answered publicly here, feel free to reach out. I think we shared the QR codes, or you just find us on LinkedIn or the common channels. With no further say, Martin, if you don't have anything to add anymore for this morning webinar, I would say we close it off and send all our attendees in a successful Tuesday morning or afternoon, depending from where they're dialing in this morning.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, then thanks everyone. Thanks. I saw everyone has a sunny day, no matter if they're in Utrecht, Oslo, or somewhere else in the world. So I wish you all a
Oh,
really
wait, Christian, I see one
yeah.
more question in the questions tab.
If there came a question in. Oh, that's
Yeah, it's about the separation of duty enforcement, those
all
hybrid
right.
environments. If you say hybrid environments, Rohan, do you mean cloud or on-premise and so on? Well, in general, separation of duty is really just one of the queries, one of the insights of the controls that you can do on this identity data graph. So in that case, the most easy form of doing that separation of duty enforcement is you still have to look at you still have to know what are toxic combinations. That's a typical format in which you can represent separation of duties. So you don't want people to have this AD group and that AD group, or this role and that role, or something else like that. And then the enforcement, well, you don't practically enforce it. That's the thing about the identity data graph. You don't avoid that people can do that, but you do at least monitor this, get notified immediately if someone gets these control, gets this toxic combination as enforcing this control. So you can then fix this issue as quickly as possible. And if you have a decent identity data graph with complete history of the past, and it might even be that at some point you're working on identity, on roles, on maybe business roles, technical roles, and all of that, and you see, oh, there is this separation of duty conflict in these roles, and then you can even look up who has had a combination of two roles that you didn't know that were a toxic combination yet in the past, and by that again address that, fix that, also look into what they did, whether fraud was actually committed maybe by looking into the target system themselves. And I'm now talking about toxic combinations of roles and AD groups. Those are the typical things. But what we've seen in practice is that it can even be something like you can't have this business role as well as access to that file share. Seen that in a financial context because the file share contained information about when people were on leave and so on, and you can't combine that with something like insurance. I don't know the exact example anymore, but if you have that data, if you have that in one system, then it becomes easy to look up these dangerous combinations, to make a control out of that, and we need to stay up to date. So it's really the closed loop approach again, but then from a separation of duty perspective. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
And otherwise, again, feel free to reach out and we sit together and take a look closer at that question. All right, then there is no other question. I see. Indeed, we can maybe make some short advertisement at the end. If you happen to be around Belgium, the Netherlands, or something, tomorrow and Wednesday we are on the CyberSec exhibition in CyberSec Europe exhibition in Brussels. So if you happen to be there, we're really happy to welcome you at our booth. We have a conversation. We have our own famous Illimity beer over there. So if you are by any chance there, please come, sit by, say hi, and that would be fantastic. For the rest, again, have a really nice Tuesday, and wish you all the best. Talk to you soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Great. Thank you all. Bye.